Welcome to the Daily Dispatch. To kick off the dispatch, we'll be covering trouble brewing in Brazil as the former President Bolsonaro's supporters stormed the government buildings in the capital. For our next headline, we'll be spotlighting Pakistan co-hosting a climate change conference in Geneva with the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And for our final headline, we'll be breaking down contentions over Sweden's joining of NATO as it refuses to fulfill Turkey's conditions. We're here to give you the news and to help you infer the world around you. I'm Tayyaba Nasar Khan, and here is your Daily Dispatch. In a major development from Brazil, about 3,000 supporters of the former far-right president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, stormed the three top-level buildings, the Congress, Presidential Palace, and the Supreme Court in the capital city, Brasilia. Now, security was breached, public property vandalized by the protesters, and a banner was unfurled from the roof of the Congress building, which read out, "Intervention," in an appeal to the military for intervention. The siege lasted over 3 hours, with Lula da Silva, the current president of Brazil, declaring a federal security intervention in the capital for a month and promising to punish the culprits. Now, da Silva also called these supporters fanatical Nazis, Stalinists, and fascists, accusing the former president of instigating these attacks through his speeches. Bolsonaro rejected these accusations, adding that attacking the public buildings was crossing the line. The former president's supporters have been camping outside of these public buildings since October 30th elections, resulting in Lula da Silva's win by a small margin of 50.8% of the vote. Bolsonaro refused to accept the win and instead claimed that the elections were fraudulent, a claim without any evidence to support it. The pro-Bolsonaro protests started peacefully with a road blockade, but took a violent turn, with the burning of the trees and tires, setting trucks and an ambulance on fire, and even attacking the police headquarters in the capital, shooting at a newspaper building that criticized Bolsonaro's policies, and targeting a water pipeline. The liberal factions of Brazil argue that Bolsonaro's tenure was marred by far-right policies that targeted the leftists and human rights activists as well, and eased the way for access to weapons, which was taken advantage of by the violent elements in his supporter base. He was also accused of being notoriously close to the military, with his supporters calling for a military intervention right after he lost the elections. This déjà vu moment was an echo of the January 6th storming of the US Capitol Hill by the former US President Donald Trump's supporters. Many world leaders, including the US President Joe Biden, said he was outrageous at the assault on democracy and the peaceful transfer of power. It goes on to show the rise of far-right groups in much of the world, including the US and Europe, making it more important to curb the fanatical ideologies and instead promote the dialogue and peaceful coexistence. Earlier, the United Nations Secretary General, in his annual address in December, also warned of the threat posed by the far-right groups. On to an important development from post-flood recovery now. Pakistan is set to co-host the International Conference on Climate-Resilient Pakistan, along with the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in Geneva today. In the day-long conference, Pakistan will present its post-flood recovery plan, Resilient Recovery, Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Framework, the 4RF, and try to seek international financial support for it. Now, last year, Pakistan faced unprecedented floods due to heavy monsoon rains and melting glaciers, submerging 1/3 of the country, displacing millions of people, and damaging agriculture. In its yearly review report 2022 on climate change, the United Nations invoked the case of floods in Pakistan as a stark reminder that climate-induced weather events will bring more disasters and catastrophes in the near future, especially for the developing world. The conference in Geneva comes as climate disasters have led to increasing calls by the developing world for loss and damage fund and financial support for the mitigation and adaptation efforts, as the vulnerable countries demand the developed world, the biggest GHG emitters, should take more responsibility. This call received renewed support with the establishment of Global Shield Fund at the COP27 in Egypt to support the rehabilitation and recovery efforts in the disaster-prone regions. It is considered one of the significant steps towards establishing a robust loss and damage mechanism globally. The conference in Geneva, which will be attended by multiple countries as well as the international financial institutions, will be a real test for the international community, especially the developed states, to match their commitments to helping vulnerable countries on climate change with concrete actions as Pakistan seeks $16 billion for the reconstruction and recovery. We'll now tell you about the NATO conundrum. Sweden has raised concerns that it will not be able to fulfill all the conditions raised by Turkey for it to join the NATO military alliance. Sweden and Finland have expressed the willingness to join NATO military alliance after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The two countries also signed a tripartite agreement with Turkey in 2022 to address Turkey's objection to their membership. Now, Turkey has demanded Sweden to expel or extradite the members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party and Fethullah Gulen, accused of sponsoring a failed military coup against Erdogan's government. Since entry to NATO works by consensus, the inability to address Turkey's concerns can continue to be a barrier to Sweden's members. The inclusion of Sweden and Finland will bring the number to 15 member states that joined the military alliance after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1991. Russia has accused the United States and NATO of continuing to expand its membership to new states. Traditionally, Russia has remained apprehensive about its security on peripheries, while experts in Europe have blamed Russia for aggressive moves, which have resulted in the rise in NATO membership, especially its annexation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2008 from Georgia, and of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Along with supporting the NATO expansion, successive US administrations have raised the issue of scaling up defense spending by the NATO members. The NATO guidelines require member states to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense spending. In 2014, only United States, Greece, and United Kingdom have spent above the 2% guideline, while equipment spending as a share of defense spending by all the member states, which NATO requires to be at 20%, continues to be on the rise since 2014. Keeping up with its goal of NATO membership, Sweden has increased its defense spending to 1.45% of the GDP in 2022 at $7.3 billion USD, which is the highest since 2005. Finland, too, since 2019, has gradually jumped its defense spending from 1.3% to 2% in 2021, the highest since 1991. On the other hand, the growing size of NATO may further increase tensions between NATO and Russia in the near future, and the possibility of crisis with states neighboring Russia may not be ruled out completely. Next on the dispatch, President of the United States, Joe Biden, made his maiden visit to the US-Mexico border since he took office in January 2021, after the new policy was introduced on January 5, 2023. According to the policy, each month, 30,000 asylum seekers from 4 countries, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, will be allowed into the United States and will be granted a 2-year work permit. However, this will be only for those who come under a policy called the parole, those with a US-based sponsor and after thorough vetting. Those who haven't cleared the process and show up at the border anyway will be sent back to Mexico, with Mexico agreeing to take back 30,000 asylum seekers. Now, rights groups call this an extension of Donald Trump's controversial policy, Title 42, which essentially refuses entry to most migrants. Biden had earlier promised to revoke this law. However, it still continues to remain in place after a Supreme Court order. The activists also stated that under the US laws and treaty obligations, asylum seekers had the right to seek asylum at the border and weren't obligated to apply within their country. Staying in the country would only put their lives and dignity in further danger, which they're escaping to seek asylum in the first place. With the House divided between Democrats and Republicans, it remains unlikely that Biden administration would reel back the policy due to mounting Republican pressure to restrict the borders. This policy is expected to further undermine liberal values in the United States, which has been under attack, especially during the Trump administration. We'll now talk about the East Asian theater. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will take a trip to the G7 member states from today. The visit comes at a time when Japan is all set to host the G7 summit in May this year. The visit to the G7 will also help Japan align its military build-up with the ongoing geopolitical alignments, as the United States encourages partners to align their policies with its pivot to the Indo-Pacific. Recently, Japan has unveiled an ambitious plan to ramp up its military for the next 5 years to 318 billion USD, in line with its revised national security strategy. The country will also see spending in the development of various defense systems, including a long-range conventional and a hypersonic missile in the next 15 years. Japan is also part of the trilateral project to produce a fighter aircraft in collaboration with the United Kingdom and Italy. Similarly, it has scaled up its military spending to 51.4 billion USD in 2023. Japan is ramping up the military buildup after growing tensions in the neighborhood due to the highest ever number of missile tests by North Korea in 2022, and with the possibility of hostility with China over the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. The rise in military exercises and spending by different countries in East Asia suggests an exacerbation of the true deficit and brewing crisis in the region. In our previous dispatch, we analyzed that any conflict over Taiwan can have economic consequences far more serious than those caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. Lastly, only days after China lifted its COVID-19 restrictions for global travelers, oil prices are witnessing a steady uptick. In recent weeks, oil prices have dropped significantly due to the shrinking demand, reducing to $80 per barrel at one point. But as the world's second biggest economy removes the pandemic restrictions, demand for the fossil fuel will increase, as China is one of the biggest importers of oil. Beijing's zero-COVID strategy elicited resentment and frustration within China, leading to massive protests, along with contributing to disruptions in the supply chain, as China-based plants of multinational corporations struggle to maintain their productivity and supply. Although the lifting of zero-COVID restriction has raised concerns regarding the resurgence of cases, it is also likely to spur the global economic growth and mitigate the supply chain concerns. That's all, folks. We'll be back tomorrow with more bite-sized news that keeps you up to date with what's happening in the country, the region, and the globe. I'm Tayyaba Nisar Khan, and this was your Daily Dispatch.